can see. You can, of course, this only works
that's
visually,
nice,
not
yes.
for recording, but it's a quite small
Right.
studio, but my work's quite small, so it's perfect for me, really. So yeah, I've been here for.
Was there ever an economical consideration in terms of the size of the studio in relationship to the size of the work?
It honestly didn't start off consciously economically, but of course, you know, as a good idea, which it turned out to be. But you can probably see. I mean, if you're recording this audibly,
no, this is fantastic.
Too much, but you can see the size of canvases I used to make in the background there, which I've been, you know, resting against the wall of my studio for 20 years or something. But,
really?
Well, I've only been here for about 10, 15 years, but yeah, I've been every studio I've been to. I've had these canvases one day saying that I'm going to sort of do something on them, but I never do. But when I was working large scale, you know, it's a sort of inverse proportion to the scale is that they took me like a day to do each one, whereas the small ones can take me 6 weeks. So
how did the big work? So was your large work more abstract, or?
Yeah. I mean, it was essentially very blocky. It was kind of architectural shapes, you know, forms.
Right.
What I was doing mostly. But you know, really, this isn't something I've done since the early 90s, really. And then I got into sort of more systems-based sort of discursive paintings where I set up rules for myself and cover the whole canvas in numbers, for example, that had systems to them, and then eventually were just random, but lots of little numbers that I made out of rubbers, old rubbers that I just used to cut numbers and sort of like stencil the numbers, not stencil, but print the numbers on. So I'd get this whole surface full of digits. So they were huge paintings as well.
Is this how your brain works? Do you kind of have to create this kind of web of constraints in order to be able to exercise creativity?
I think so. I think that's kind of a prerequisite. Certainly for me, partly because of the way that, I don't know, the way I've sort of found working creatively, you know, very problematic unless you have these parameters and brackets. I think some people find the sort of they're already restricted, or they've got a focus, you know, just natural focus. But when I was at college, my studio looked like it was inhabited by a different student every week. The tutors could not tutor me because they didn't know what to say to me from one week to the next, because it completely changed. And I was kind of working my way through the history of art, you know, 20th century painting, and like a chameleon. And, you know, one of my tutors just said to me, don't just do something, stand there. You know, he's just like, stop, you know, just, you know, please just stop painting, just think or plan something out a bit more. So I didn't really take his advice until years and years later, but you know, I'm sort of nervous when I'm not actually making something, but I've learned that if I constrain it with certain rules, and if the rules become apparent in the work, that's all the better, because, you know, to some degree they're more readable when the rules are sort of inscribed in the visual, you know, the end product. So it's become a real necessity for me. You know? Although I'm kind of, you know, to be honest, Marko, I'm recently tempted to sort of see what I would come up with if I didn't constrain myself with predetermined set of rules. This is kind of in the last exhibition I had in November in Germany, was sort of playing with that, you know, myself. But it's just a feeling that the rules no longer are as important or even work for me, because they may be hiding other things, you know. So I'm just tempted to see. I mean, the danger is that everything would unfold and the work was only valid because of the rules, and that without the rules, I just get into this sort of subjective field again that I try to avoid, and the works become the sort of works that I was running a mile from for the last 20 years or 30 years. And but I'm sort of tempted, you know, I've come to the point where I just feel I need to see what's on the other side of the fence, as it were.
I guess I guess we see the rules as not as part of creativity, but in fact, rules are perhaps part of the artwork itself.
Certainly part of the reading of the artwork as well, I think. I mean, when I say I'm sort of changing, I don't mean particular. I mean, I think what I'm prepared to do is to just set off somewhere and then retroactively understand what the rules of the game are that I'm playing, rather than.
I guess if we were to draw a parallel to psychotherapy, for example, Freudian psychotherapy, there is this notion that we're oppressed, right? We're self-oppressed, and then the rules we kind of put inside in order to, I don't know, stop certain desires that are what either socially unacceptable or that would lead to a kind of happy life. So I'm just wondering whether there is a correlation, not correlation, but whether there is a similar kind of process that we go through when we set these rules in kind of artistic production.
So in your summing up there, the rules were in place to repress sort of freedom.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
I'm just trying to think how that would translate. I mean, no doubt that's true. But on the other hand, I find the rules incredibly satisfying. They satisfied me, you know.
Because I basically what this conversation is making me think is whether freedom is overrated in some way, or whether it's a completely false paradigm.
I would tend to agree with that. I remember reading a long time ago, you know, the myth of Sisyphus, the Albert Camus book when I was a teenager, I think. But I do remember that having an effect, or, you know, it sort of underlined some of the things I was thinking, I suppose, as you do as a teenager. But then the twist was that Sisyphus found pleasure, much to the god's annoyance, in his task of his punishment, in a way.
Yes.
The end of the book is that the act of defiance against the sentence by the gods was to enjoy it, to laugh in their face when you are just rolling a ball up a hill and it goes down again, you roll it again, you know. And somehow there was a pleasure linked to the restrictions that could be found and should be found, perhaps, in defiance of the people who are imposing rules. And of course, my rules are totally self-imposed. Well, I mean, I feel they are, but yeah, I don't know. It's I don't know what would be in total opposition to having rules. I mean, that's scary. That terrifies me.
Yeah, it's like nothingness almost. Yeah, very nihilistic.
Yeah, or so individualistic that it's incommunicable. Of course, a lot of people who make work that they think is very individualistic and sort of comes from their dreams or something, and then they make work, they almost don't realize that they're following certain rules or ways of producing painting, which is looks like a Peter Doig or something. So they use that paradigm as a way of being individualistic. In actual fact, of course, they fall into patterns and accepted sort of styles of work that signify, you know, a more sort of free, dream worldy place, you know, subjective space. But it's actually, you know, if you look at it, it's got lots of sort of hidden rules in it, you know. So I don't know how you can even escape them. It's just, you know, I don't have any answers to these things. It's just I knew that there was the question became very prominent in the work, you know, at an early stage, and I just, you know, it really, and I can say this. Some people, you know, I was quite impressed when I went to the Royal College how articulate and intelligent a lot of my fellow students were, you know. I was kind of intimidated by that, as well. I didn't feel necessarily, and I'm sure a lot of people have that feeling, it's not unique to me, but I was quite impressed. And I mean, a lot of people sort of arrived at the conclusions that I arrived at through sort of a theoretical understanding, whereas it took me a long time of just maybe being influenced by what they said and it seeping into me. And then I arrived at it kind of through the back door, 7 years later or something, almost by just the sheer sort of amount of worry that I had about practice. Because I left the college and I just went into a studio in Stoke Newington in North London with a friend, and we kind of hid away there like monks and just painted, without any exhibitions or anything, and scraped, living off some form of income support or something for years, which I wouldn't advise. But I mean, after a while, I think that got to me, and it's just, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I do remember the moment when the rules really showed me the way forward was when I said to my studio mate, I may as well paint the same painting again as make a new one. And I had all this work, loads of big paintings and small paintings, all in the storeroom that I was pretty much taking up the whole of the storeroom. And so I pulled out all my old works that looked like a dozen different artists had made them. And I started copying them like stroke for stroke, sort of faking them. So I went and bought the canvas from the same old shop, and some of these paintings were at least 10 years old. And then I started reproducing them maybe 4 or 5 times. So I had a line of duplicates of my original, sort of faking my own work. And I didn't really sort of rationalize it in my head, but that was the ultimate sort of rule making, because the end goal, the painting would finish when it reached the level of the first one. So the end was already written and inscribed in before I started, and all you have to do is get to the end, the finish line, and then it's clear cut. That's it, done. And for better or worse, que sera, sera. And there's a clarity to that and a relief, a real relief that I could now spend the next few months just making these things. And I kind of knew they would work, They were sort of bulletproof. They didn't.
Does that mean that one of your kind of questions in your early career was when to stop painting, as often a kind of big question in a painter's practice?
Well, a lot of painters have that problem. When's a painting finished? It wasn't the main problem. Although I suppose that's a problem for all painters. My paintings tended to be quite quick, and it wasn't when to stop. It was how to start them, and what language to start. What size of brush do you pick up? What color do you own? What color should you do? What type of paint? What size of canvas? Is it going to be abstract or figurative? Is it all these things? It's like this. How do you even choose what sort of painter you want to be? And I was always, partly as one thing that I was sure of as I wanted to paint, partly because, if I opened that up, it would get even more, I would get even more anxious. So I wanted to work within the history and the world of painting, I was pretty sure of that.
How were you so sure? What made you so sure?
My father was a painter, perhaps sort of one massive influence growing up as a child. And because we were taken on holidays, and every holiday we went to, and traveling around Europe camping and stuff, we'd always go to art historical sites. We'd go to Florence and that, but we'd do a Van Gogh trail where we'd go to every site where he painted, in the countryside, and that was our holidays, So, and I could have rebelled against that, but I actually really enjoyed it. I can remember even as a sort of probably an 8-year-old or something, going to the Rijksmuseum and being quite excited to see the Night Watchman by Rembrandt or something, and to the, and Frans Hals and things. My parents used to joke that I used to like these paintings so much. So I don't know, it was just something that was always there.
Because the reason why I ask, I never had an art education, but when I was when I was younger, when I was in my teenage years, I went to this local, I'm Serbian, so I lived in this small town in Serbia, and there was a small atelier in the town where we had two painters who were kind of local painters who taught basic, who taught us how to draw and paint what we see, basically. And there was a group of young people that were coming to that small atelier. It was very informal. But I remember them, and again, they probably come from quite a traditional education in arts and painting. And I remember that they were always looking at us and kind of trying to define which one of us is a drawer, which one is a painter. It's like, who thinks in line and who thinks in color? And I remember I was always told that I'm a painter because I kind of think I see color, while some other people see edges of spaces. Do you identify with that kind of language?
Yeah, I do. I mean, not particularly the whether one is a painter or a drawer, because I think you can be both, obviously. But I mean, I know a lot of. I mean, I teach as well, and you can see that. Well, actually, most people start off drawing, and it takes them a little bit of a jump to find a way of translating their drawings into painting. So it's a common thing. But some people just stay at drawing, and some people paint, but they're actually drawing. They're linear. And maybe that's what you're saying.
Yes.
Or some people think in blocks and form, and rather than outline. And there's a lot. I mean, I'm sure I'm more on the drawing than the painting, for example. Do you think you're more in the painting than the? Are you more? I
think I'm probably more into painting, actually.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, your drawing, your technique is it's sort of line by line in a sense, even if in its kind of formal sense.
Yeah. I mean, what I've seen of your work, I could see that you're maybe, if there is a division, you're maybe. Did the teachers in Serbia, did they form an opinion about you as well?
Yes. So they said I'm a painter. I kind of think in blocks of color, which, of course, like when I share with some other friends, or actually friends that I was in that kind of small group with, and then some of them actually went on and studied art. They actually then are quite frustrated with that division. They felt very constrained by it, and they felt it's a kind of early 20th century idea of art, and they feel it's a kind of an oppressive element,
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's being imposed on you, or you're being told you can't be this, then it is oppressive. Yeah. But I see no harm in playing to your strengths or being aware of things, but obviously I think there's no hard line.
Yeah,
I suppose the idea would be to be good at both, but I've been shy of color because I was diagnosed as colorblind at school, so I've always had a kind of slight fear of color or something like that, or not quite sure that if I did a colored thing or thought in terms of color, that I would be communicating the same sort of experience to anybody else, because colorblind people see in color, but I think it's something to do with naming the colors is more. I never think about it day to day. It's just when people point out to me that something's not the color I said it was. But so I've always had a slight sort of being slightly less confident about thinking about color or focusing on it in work.
Right.
That would be so. Whereas line, I feel much more at home with in terms of demarcating things. But I don't see that you have to be one or the other, really.
The technique that you use is in a way a kind of traditional technique. You kind of use it with confidence. I mean, I studied architecture, so as an architect coming into the art world and trying to produce art, and then on the other hand, kind of trying to understand this imposed set of rules, not the self-imposed set of rules. You said earlier how you were sometimes intimidated, and I think in the environment of an educational institution and while studying. And I think there is something quite gentle in that sense in your work, where you almost acknowledge a certain intimidation, yet we're kind of confronting it through a belief or confidence in the technique that you use and in a kind of small scale of the work.
Yeah, I mean, these things I've been particularly conscious of, maybe become conscious of them. They're not sort of the reasons why I do these things, but it's been a playfulness to, you know, sneaking in a kind of old-fashioned technique into a contemporary setting, and a sort of conversation. So there's a kind of, I think it sometimes has been quite confusing for people I've worked with, or curators, for example, have had a slight suspicion of what the whole thing is, you know, whether to think of it as contemporary or not, or to sort of relevant or not, and all that. So there's a kind of, and then some people also quite enjoy that kind of knife edge it sits on, where it's sort of tongue-in-cheek but very sincere at the same time sometimes. So using tempera has certainly, I mean, I just use it. I just use it really because I've got so used to it. I hardly think about it and its implications. Perhaps I should more, but it's just become something that I feel competent in, and it's very easy for me to do. You know, really, it's easy to make. I don't fetishize it. I try not to fetishize it. I try not to really play too much on its historical references. I mean, other people seem much more interested in it than I am. To me, I could be using or something, you know, but tempera's just a slightly easier to handle for me. But, you know, that's not to say that I don't recognize in the past that it's become a kind of a talking point, or it's kind of almost like on the one hand, it's very traditional, but then some of the imagery and the way you're positioning these rules and setting things up can be seen as, I don't know, something quite contemporary perhaps, or some talking about institutional critique or something like that, whereas doing it in tempera is something seen as kind of obtuse and kind of interesting. I can't honestly say that.
So it was purely a sense of comfort.
Yeah. I mean, I came to it by accident, like all these things. You know, I thought it was something else. I thought it was going to achieve on my large paintings a finish that was more like a fresco. You know, we got given a lesson at the Royal College by artist David Tyndall, I remember, and I tried it, and I just started making some huge paintings with it. You know, cracking like 24 eggs in a bucket, and they were sort of a shimmer to it. Yes, this sort of glistening thing on canvas, sort of pearlescent look to it. Depends on the pigments you use, of course, but then I just started using it for small paintings and doing all sorts of little sketches with it, and it just stuck with me. It's a very sort of meditative process as well, cracking an egg every day, and something about that sort of procedure that's repetitive, and it dries instantly, so I can keep working on it, and it's got a very thin film, so it doesn't build up a horrible sort of crusty surface as you're working on it again and again. And it can be opaque if you use the right pigments, so you can obliterate the things underneath. I didn't want to do the cross-hatching technique or play with transparency or anything. I wanted them to be. I mean, I suppose what is, Marko, is that I do like the effect of it for the feeling it gives off when I'm copying these images, because it's a very deadpan medium, the way I use it anyway, and it delivers an image back to you that started as a photograph but ends as a sort of copy of a photograph, but a very deadpan one with a very opaque surface and a very sort of matte surface and a very
matte surface,
very almost unappealing, just sort of not too seductive and not shiny and lustrous. It's very muted and deadpan. So I call it like a plastic glove over a hand. It's got that. It's a hand, but it's a very ghostly hand or something. The way I use it is that I can. I mean, the thing I put down is pretty much the thing I put down. It doesn't mix, and it kind of obliterates the thing underneath. So there's not a huge amount of seduction in terms of seeing the color through the color and all that stuff. It's very. I mean, it's almost like my earlier coats are rehearsals for the last one, which just sits on the top and you can't really see what's underneath.
I think it's because I often kind of want to play with what's below, and then I guess maybe tempera doesn't allow that, because it either mixes or it doesn't. Perhaps, I don't know. Maybe I just haven't explored the technique so much.
You could, I mean, what would be nice is you can sand it down and reveal things under the layers, and you could do that sort of thing. But I mean, I had a little bit of whiting or chalk to my colours, so they kind of, I suppose they become a little bit chalky as well. So they have this sort of muffled quality to the look of them, and it's a kind of it's almost something that I just notice about them rather than have chosen it specifically for that purpose. It's just when I reflect upon the way they look as opposed to the photograph, for example, this sort of ghostly version of the photograph is something that sort of appeals to me.
I mean, there is something very meditative about this conversation that we're having, where I guess you really profoundly meditate over a technique. And it's not, you're not, as you say, you're not digesting its kind of philosophical weight. You're just embracing what it allows you to do. And there's something really beautiful in that. And so then I wonder, so there's that kind of strong meditative element in your work. And it sounds like what the subject of the work is, so I was going to say what I'm struggling with is to kind of set hierarchies within your work, which why would anyone do that anyway, but if we are to, but if one is to put things in relationship to one another, like put the technique in relationship to the subject of the work, in relationship to the kind of duration, the process, the kind of length that you kind of meditate over it.
Yeah.
How do those things relate? Or is there a hierarchy between them?
I almost divide that labor up to, I think when I'm painting, the hierarchy is the getting it right technically, and there's not too many ways it can go. So it's about that tightrope of just staying on that line, and holding your breath. And sometimes I just wish it was 2 weeks ahead so it would be finished, but you've got to hold your breath until you get there, and sometimes it goes wrong, but then I have to bring it back to the line again and just keep walking on tightrope till the end, So when I'm making the work, in a sense, I think the answer would be that the medium and the meditation and all this process is definitely way ahead of what I'm thinking, in the forefront of my mind. That's not to say that that's just kind of switch off entirely, period either, But just for simplicity's sake, the bit that I'm less keen on, the bit that gives me more angst, is the bit before I start a particular project, and it's kind of deciding, right. So the medium, let's say the medium does a certain thing to an image, and I have to sit back and think what effects that has on the image, and so I know it's going to have this effect, or I've witnessed it doing this before, and if I combine that with what's actually going to happen with, well, if it does that, then what should I do with that effect? What's the right thing to do with that effect? So if it causes a sort of ghostly, muted, silent, meditative thing, what am I going to do with that in a given situation? and maybe, you know, combining that with other things I've heard or read or whatever about whatever. So I have to do a bit of thinking and set up a project for myself that I could think that I'm going to enjoy for the next year when I'm painting these things, you know. So that, and committing to that project is quite, I don't enjoy that period particularly, because I also don't know what's going to tell me that this is the thing to do. You know, I worry about it and I change my mind, and I might ask a few friends what they think of it and judge their reaction or something. You know, like, what do you do? How do you know where to go with it? And at the same time, you've got all these doubts about, you know, if you're going to show in a particular gallery or with a curator or something, you know, what are they going to think about it? And oh, I don't know. And in the end, you know, it's just so many voices in your head. So at that period, it's not the medium, it's the idea, you know, and the context and art history and all the sorts of things that are going around your head. But I tend to enjoy that less. So I divide the process up. Once I get going, it's pretty much stick on the line until it ends. And you know, there's a few changes of directions between each painting that I can make, but that's quite limited, you know. So I suppose it's being attentive to what the medium's doing, as far as I can understand what it's doing in the context of contemporary art, and just trying to make moves which make sense with what I'm going to do. You know, so it's very difficult to talk about the work without having the work in front of us to point to examples and things. But I'm happy to do that. I sometimes realize I'm talking about things I've got in my head that you might not be seeing.
No, but I think there's something elusive about not having the work in front, and it's almost inviting us to really explore your work. So the research process that happens before you start a series of paintings, how long is that in comparison to the painting process?
Oh, it's much shorter. I mean, because the painting process can, you know, that will take maybe even 2 years, you know. So, and then you know, obviously, I'm thinking about what the next thing might be throughout that 2 years.
Okay, so the meditation actually helps the next thing happen.
Yes, and you know, once you come to the end of you know, I do tend to work from project to project or show to show. So, and you'd think after 2 years of being able, when you came to the end of it, you'd have the next thing in your mind, but it never quite works like that. There's always a period of not knowing at all what the next thing is going to be. Particularly if there isn't a context for it. If I have an actual venue and a space to show in, and you know, something, or a group show or something, that's a sort of nice, helpful parameters to some you know, to what the next thing will be. But if it's just like now, I'm just coming to the studio and working, I don't know where it's going to be shown or anything, you know, it's much more difficult to.
Is it a Vancouver exhibition where you've kind of documented the space, which was the subject of the work?
Yes, well, I'd done that a few times in different iterations, but that was a nice one because it was a huge space. You know, it was a museum that this collector had. He used to work in real estate, and he'd got himself this beautiful. Bob Rennie had this beautiful museum that took over a whole block of buildings, and he'd knocked through the ceilings to create a sort of a space that was, I think, 5 stories high. So it was like a cathedral. So and it was long as well. It's the size of about 3 or 4 tennis courts, and really high.
Wow.
And then there was another huge room, and it was a quite imposing, scary place. And he'd collected maybe 20 of my works or something. And you know, he offered to give me a show there. It was great. So the thing was, you know, we started putting all the works around once when I was there, and you know, they weren't making any sense in that huge space, you know. So the solution was, and I'm glad he offered this or allowed me to do this rather, was that I paint I paint the space, but including, well, my idea was to come and take photographs of previous exhibitions being installed. So I had Mona Hatoum, for example, Damien Muppet, there was Martin Creed, Thomas Houseago and Amy Bissoni, and I visited the place and took installation shots of the works being installed. So you got a kind of like a privileged sort of behind the scenes vision of what it would be to run a museum and to install the works with all the cherry pickers and all the rest of it there. The works were somewhere there, artworks were in the mix as well. So it was this slightly more crowded space, and I would photograph that and from different angles, and then make paintings which would hang in the viewpoint of the photograph that I'd taken. So yeah, so I did these sort of site-specific paintings. I'd done different iterations of this, over the years. But it was a really nice solution to that, because I just had two tiny paintings in this huge hall, for example. And you could walk in there and just look like a big empty space. And then you'd see these two paintings facing each other at opposite ends, and you would just they would have this feedback between them. One was a view of the space from the other one, But inside the paintings was the images of different artists' works being installed, if that makes sense.
Are you ever intimidated by the gallery space, given how small your work is?
Well, again, that was a kind of, I was saying, this sort of knife edge that the work comes on, this sort of slight, I enjoyed this sort of cheekiness of showing small works in a big space, sort of slightly audacious, and should really be there, taking up this huge space, etc., and representing nothing but the space, and showing other artists' work as well. It's like my work actually wasn't there. It was just, in one sense, you walk away with a vision of a memory of the other artists' works being installed. And so I just enjoy all these sorts of ways of kind of being part of it, but also standing outside of it to some degree, or being. Is
this a commentary on the art world? Is this a commentary on kind of the ironies of the world that you're part of?
No, I mean, I mean, I enjoy all that sort of institutional critique, and but I can't say that that was the primary reason for doing it. It was the solution to my own personal problem, and it was what was around.
Which is the subject of the work.
Yes. And it was a kind of much more self-referential, minimal kind of, again, a rule which, what's the painting of? It's pretty clear it's a painting of the space in which the painting hangs. So the rule is inbuilt into the experience of looking at the painting. There's no question why I've painted that. You might think, why bother? Why bother is a different question from why I painted. It's a painting of the space. Yeah, I get that.
But you solved your issue. You solved our issue, and you were able to kind of move on. And
I've solved my issue. Yeah. So again, it's like the tempera. Do I think about the implications of tempera, or do I just do it? I pretty much do it, and then I consider after the effect. Do I think about critiquing the museum? No, but as it solved my problem, then inevitably you get involved in appropriation and copyright and all sorts of other issues, and the white cube, and so then I start thinking about that, and so maybe the next time I do it with that kind of cheeky knowledge and playing games with that. It offers me that chance. But honestly, I arrived at a solution to my own problem of what to paint, for example.
Right. So you're not really angry at the art world in any way, or you're not angry at the world around you. You're just kind of trying to channel your own energy. Yeah,
I mean, I'm angry at the world. I'm angry at lots of things,
aren't you? Okay, let's talk about that.
Shouting at the television every night is, one of my hobbies. But I am, but in the art, in my practice, no, it's it would be churlish for me to have an exhibition in a beautiful museum like this with sympathetic curators and to be making a terrible comment on their power in the art world. I mean, that is, it sort of goes without saying. There is a conversation there, of course there is, and who gets shown in museums and what power people have in the art world. It's not it's not uninteresting to me at all. It does interest me. But it's honestly not the motivation for doing it. It's a sort of byproduct of doing it. And I think you would be difficult to look at my work and say what is his opinion about that, and I don't see that it's a failure of the work for it not to answer these questions. I mean, I don't know.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I don't think the work needs to address every issue in the world.
I mean, I am interested in things. I mean, copyright is something that I've become interested in because I had to deal with it at certain stages, because I paint images of other artists' works and photographs of other people that have taken. And so I was asked to give some talks on copyright, so I had to research it, and I found it it's not only an interesting issue just per se, just by itself, but it's interesting to me because it does have a sort of parallel question about authenticity and authorship. And I do think that sort of philosophical questions about these sorts of things are one way of interpreting the questions that I just found myself in when I was at art college, wondering what to paint next and what style to paint in, and having all this historical knowledge, but not finding anything that's mine to do, or understanding how I could even do that. And I think when you look at copyright, it touches on all these things, and it's almost assuming that everybody should reinvent everything all the time anew, and you're not really allowed to reference or borrow without paying or being indebted to someone, which seems, the way I think about it, it seems quite ridiculous, On the other hand, of course, I understand people could get quite upset if you start using their images for your own gain, or for defamatory statements, or whatever, for purposes other than they'd intended them. That's obvious, but there has to be room. It's all about intention, I think. But I find it a really fascinating and tricky area. The more I look into it, or the more I've had to give talks on it and things like that, with lawyers, and it's a grey area. But I just see that as I don't think I've made work particularly about that. Maybe I have.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that would be the main focus. And what I could contribute to that debate visually would be so partial, I think. I think my work could be used as examples in a debate or a lecture or a talk or some other form like that, or you could write a book about it. That would be an interesting way of disseminating the idea, but my paintings could only act as examples of that in a book or a talk, not really going to be able to talk about that themselves,
I think that's a very important point, and it's an interesting and very contemporary point, the one about copyright and this kind of mass dissemination of imagery across, especially with the digital environment. I found you on Instagram, and that's where we connected. And I was kind of surprised to see you there, because if your work is the most anti-Instagram, you value image so much that you meditate over it for months. And then you're in dialogue with the environment where image lasts a couple of seconds and it's already immediately superseded by another image. How are you finding the digital environment in relation to your work?
Probably a sense I'm not comfortable in it. I really, but it's almost this tsunami and you're inevitably seduced into it somehow, or this, just because your friends are doing things and then you're expected to sort of join in the conversations, and more and more you have conversations and everybody knows what everybody's doing and you're out of it. So, there's no, I have been not reluctant, I've just been less interested in it, but inevitably I'm being sucked into it. And recently, I suppose you saw the works. I had the show in Berlin in November, but it's the day after the exhibition started, there was a lockdown in Berlin and lockdown here, and it's pretty much been nobody can see it. So that made me compelled to, and there was a lot of paintings I did for it. So, and I might have done this anyway, to be honest, Marko, but so I thought I'd just put up all the, I will this time, I'll just put up all the images, you know, 1 or 2 every week for the next month of the whole show and a little bit about it, so that at least my, you know, friends in London have an idea that I'm doing something, you know. So anyway, I'm just giving you my excuses why I've joined in that. But I think your question was really more interesting than that. It's more about, I think was more about what if there's a discord or a loss maybe in putting images up there.
I mean, I personally don't think it's a loss, to be honest. I think your work should be in dialogue with that, because it's work that you know, gives value to an image in a way that Instagram takes away. I think the platform is always I guess the platform, it's a platform in a way.
I think, you know, the reason I hadn't done it before is because I always thought, well, what do I, you know, is this, what do I want, given that it is a platform, as you say, it's a medium in itself. What would be the sort of version that I would want to do with it, you know? I think I overthought it, and probably also knew I didn't want to overthink it. I didn't want to be too sort of arch or arty on it, you know, London, you know. And it may just be the best things to be more diaristic or something. I'm also quite, without sounding overly self-righteous, I was a bit embarrassed by, you know, self-promotion, pure self-promotion.
Yes,
but I think in a way that's the most honest thing you can do, and it's really good, you know. I think everybody's got so used to self-promotion, it's almost invisible now. Yes. You know, if everybody's doing it, it's no longer, you know, you don't stand out as showing off or something. You just sort of, you're just showing. That's it. So it's quite generous, I think. And it feels
communicating. I mean, there is a degree of communication within it. I think that's how we should see it. Yeah.
And you know, it's true. I mean, you wouldn't have contacted me if it hadn't been for that. So, you know, it's always how it affects images and our reception of images, let alone our reception of paintings that are posted on there as images, as small images on a screen. I think it will. I mean, it has already affected your attention span and what you expect to see and how you expect to see it, and a kind of a new delivery of imagery, and you know, a sort of like a addiction in some way, and that's all kind of interesting, I suppose. I mean, I'm not really qualified and experienced enough using it to say anything really new about it, but it is. You know, it's a step forward in our reception of imagery, and I think it's just whether you want to make your work, or whether I would want to make my work with that in mind, or not, or just make it for some other reason, and then But I think more and more, obviously, artists get more of a kind of feedback or a kick out of their images, final destination being you know, Instagram or something like that. So inevitably they will have that as a target, you know. And
I found that as a real mechanism to connect to people that are in a completely different world. I really found that as the only mechanism I could have to show the work that I was producing. So then I guess when that is my starting point, the format of Instagram becomes a series of some kind of predetermined constraints that I'm kind of working with, interestingly. So I mean, I do have a feeling that it will inform, you know, work that is being produced or that will be produced by people that are born into this technological time.
Of course, what you don't get is the sort of materiality. I suppose it's it sort of favors image, maybe and pattern, and
absolutely.
I
mean, I agree. It's not sufficient by itself. I guess one thing it does is generate audience, and in an environment where every gallery has on their website says unsolicited submissions will be ignored. I mean, what can one do?
Absolutely, no, it's. I mean, when when the art world is so tied up and increasingly so, the middle size and the smaller galleries are sort of closing, or finding it very difficult, and then they won't take a chance on a new artist, and the more established galleries are working with the estates of established artists as well.
Yes.
As more than you.
Yeah.
There's less and less opportunity to bridge the gap from making your own work to making any inroads into the gallery system. It's more and more difficult. So obviously, it's things are changing. I mean, things are really changing. I mean, with the coronavirus, everything, God knows what's going to happen. It's really, everything's in the air, I suppose.
Is there a project that's been inspired by the current moment?
I don't think I'm contemplating anything I could say specifically to do with the virus and all the ramifications of it. But I mean, there may be a sense of almost freedom, because everything's, it's like a new, potentially a little bit like a new, scary new world. So you may as well just do the things you've been putting off and that sort of thing. Maybe it's a little bit of more impetus to that, because there's nothing secure. I mean, everybody's individual situation is so different, but I don't know. It's my life has shrunk as everybody's has, but
it's unbelievable.
I mean, sometimes these shrinkages in a way are like putting rules on yourself or parameters on your work as well. It might not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, I can say that I literally just been the last week or two thinking, I go for these walks with my daughters, maybe one at a time, after they finish school, and it's been dark even at 4 or 5 o'clock. And so we go for walks at 6 o'clock or whatever. It's dark, right? And we just walk through the streets, and we have a few sort of routes that we go around. We chat. It's been very nice. And I've been taking photographs of things just along the way on the phone, And then, just that itself becomes a routine and a rule and a kind of circular thing, and repetition and a routine, and sort of has a lot of the hallmarks of what I do anyway. And something nice about the nighttime and nocturnal thing, and the sort of almost claustrophobic world of the bubbles that you're in, and all this sodium lights lighting the streets, and they're empty, and it's quite sort of dramatic. So, and then I've been,
and the wet surface of the streets and reflections.
There's reflections and the lights. So I've literally just have been doing a lot of playing on Photoshop, which again is something I tended not to do. Again, it's like Photoshop's this endless horizon of possibilities that I find. So when I worked from photographs before, I would the rule is just do the photograph as it comes to you. Don't endlessly change it to your own subjective taste or something, because it's just endless, So, but this is part of my loosening up. I've allowed myself to really play with the curves and Photoshop things. I don't know what I'm doing, but I know it creates this, enhances this magical nocturnal world, and reducing it to almost black and white.
It reveals things. It reveals things that otherwise you wouldn't have seen.
Literally, I was, taking photographs of the phone and just reducing it down to it's almost black, and then taking it back to Photoshop to literally reveal by light and changing vectors and things to see what's hidden in the data. And you get this kind of strange fog pixelation. So, right. So I just thought I'm going to do some paintings from them. Just, you know, they'll be my lockdown paintings or something. Just this repetition of these streets, but they're quite magical. They're sort of, you know, they're quite romantic in a way, but they're not about a romantic situation. So.
That might really be the movement that follows. It's a kind of real kind of awareness of our built environment, or just environment in which we are. I mean, I think everyone's had this moment of realizing how yellow the trees are in the autumn. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen the colors as kind of intensely as I saw them this year.
Yeah, well, everybody said that about, you know, when, especially in the first lockdown, when there was no planes and no cars, and you could hear the birds for the first time, and you know, there's a sort of like a heightened awareness of just walking around in the streets. I think a lot of people really commented on that. I really enjoyed that. And
I guess one thing we haven't spoken about is photography and the importance of photography in your work, because we spoke about pigments and the kind of meditative process, well, the translating the photograph, but actually the photograph is also quite an important starting point.
Yeah.
And so, are you also a photographer?
No. Nobody's called me that or shown the slightest interest in my photographs. I have never shown them really.
Really, but that's, I mean,
it's so
interesting.
I don't. It's funny. I mean, you know, you when do you become a photographer and not a photographer, and what does that depend
exactly.
on?
I mean, yes.
I've always used them as tools or starting points for the paintings, you know, more or less. But you know, I don't think you could be hard and fast. But I suppose there'd be a nervousness if I showed my photographs just as photographs. They would be in a different conversation. Yeah, so you'd be compared to other photographers, obviously, and the history of ideas of thinking about photography. So they would be under a different scrutiny than the paintings are, and which would be interesting. You know, but their intention when I take them isn't always about that sort of conversation. So, you know, there might be cliches and photographic terms that once they're painted, they're not so cliched, you know, perhaps, or they talk about cliche or something in a different way. So there's a slight sort of nervousness about putting them in that conversation arena. I suppose, yeah, they could be seen as just part of the work, part of my work, and they would join that conversation, but that's a slightly different thing. So maybe again, it's just about lack of confidence or nervousness about entering that conversation. But the way I mean, I've always taken photographs like everybody has, but I think I use I mean, I love the tool of the camera because it shows you, obviously it shows you how the person behind the lens is, what they're looking at, and it gives you insight into what their outlook on the world is and what they notice, and their attitude to the thing in front of them. So it's incredible. You give 6 different people a camera, say go and photograph the same thing, they do it differently. I mean, it's be the same for drawing, but it's really revealing, I think, in a photograph what it brings out. So there's that, and I've always felt I have a particular way, or I've got a particular way of looking at a particular scene or things I look for. I kind of know, I do feel I know what I'm trying to frame, you know, in a particular way. I don't know how that's really changed over time. So I think there's something that I do particularly in photographs, but I'd also say that I use photographs as just a set of rules as well. The information is for the paintings is held in the photographs, so they function as a very sort of clear set of instructions to me make a painting. So they perform that function. That's primarily why I use them. When I told you the story about copying my own work was the photograph in a way that I copied. It was the model.
Yeah.
That I just made the next 6 paintings from, and I did that for a while. And I looked for other things that I could use as models for the next paintings. And for a while, I was doing sort of little diagrammatic things from memories of sitting in I remember I was an usher in the ICA cinema, and I used to watch a film 15 times or something. And I'd try and do little diagrams of parts of the film, slightly progressing. So I tried memory as a model of, giving me the rules, but it's much less, satisfying somehow. So I went through different things, painting numbers, whatever it would be, but photographs was another version of something that was a pre-given that would determine the next stages. So, and it's been very useful for that. But within imagery, sorry, I think I'm trying to answer about 10 questions in the same sentence, which is just confusing. But there's another aspect of photography, which is, I don't always use my own photographs for a start, because I feel the same pleasure in finding the way I would like to portray the world through a photograph, but I can easily find that in other photographs or fragments of other photographs and things like that. And sometimes,
does the viewer ever know whether it was your photograph or not, or you kind of try to blend the? So photography is really, well, if we are to talk about hierarchies again, photography is really not primary thing at all.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily know if it was my photograph. Would I care? I mean, I remember once, for example, or on several occasions, I've tried, because often the paintings would be site specific, so I'd have to take photographs of a particular location. And sometimes it's just not possible to travel there for one reason or another. So I'd ask a technician or something to take the photograph that I think is very objective. I give them rules: just stand there, hold the camera about chest height, or not too high, keep it a bit lower than you'd think.
Yeah.
Straight, keep the vertical, and just a certain wide angle, and just shoot whatever's there. Slightly overexpose it just so I can see everything, and I used to think that was all I did. That's just all I do. But the results were never real. They'd always come back to me, and they'd always be like, "Oh no, it's just not quite right." So I'd sometimes use them, but they wouldn't be as I don't know. It's very difficult to say. I mean, I really, my head is.
So is there an element of fiction? No. But I think just follow your thoughts wherever they go. There isn't a question. It's a.
There's a certain. I mean, I know there's a certain mystery or oddness or spookiness. I don't know what word to use in a certain image, or the way you frame an image of a space, for example, with a few objects in it. That you have to find the right. It's as if you just move the camera and it just clicks on a moment where everything seems slightly artificially placed, slightly uncanny, or that's a terrible word, but it's like it's staged. That may be to do with 1,000 things of symmetries and
heights and lights and
just sort of an intuitive, but there's a moment when that whole thing looks staged, like a sort of Thomas the Man thing, it's just not quite real. That's the sort of feeling that I like, and I'll find it in not just my photographs, you'll see it in postcards and all sorts of things, imagery, whatever. And it's very different from pure documentary photograph, or if you get like photographers that come and take documents of installations that I've made in the galleries, they always seem very glossy and sort of sexy in a way, and I'm really trying to find a really deadpan, muted, silence, frozen image, you know, nothing with any emotion or, you know, just like a very silent sort of gaze, as if you're just gazing forever without even looking. It doesn't matter what the objects are, and it's like you just become aware of looking rather than what you're looking at, you know. That's a feeling that I really love, you know. But I don't need to take the photograph, but I can look for that if I'm taking a photograph, but it could come because someone else has taken it. And that's really interesting. So I'm not particularly possessive about owning the photograph or being the author of it, but it's the feeling I want the photograph to induce in me anyway. I wonder if other people even see what I'm seeing, you know, a lot of the time. But I sometimes think then when I translate that into a painting, it kind of even highlights that even more, this kind of, because the painting is a much more frozen, time-consuming, gazing at something without even looking at what you're painting. It's just the process takes precedence, and the object that the picture, you're not even aware when you're painting what you're painting half the time. So I think when you're looking at the painting, you're in my headspace a little bit more. So it helps that the photograph is halfway there already, I think. But yeah, I mean, so it's about this sort of prolonged gaze, sort of hypnotic space. That's I don't know.
I can see that. I can see that. No, I can completely see that. I'm wondering if you know, with that in mind, is there an element of fiction in the work?
There has been.
When or in that, actually in that moment of translation.
Well, I try not to translate I'm like a good translator. I don't add my own jokes or personality. You know, when you're translating, you have to do exactly, you know, what you.
Do you ever do like an extra socket where there isn't a socket?
No, well, not really. No, because that would really annoy me. And you know, it's these. I don't know why, and I don't. I also don't find it would add anything of, you know, really profoundly wouldn't add anything more.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the thing which makes me more apparent. Yeah. And I don't even know if I want to be there anyway. But I don't see that sort of self-expression is desirable or even interesting. Just the translation thing, it just reminded me, I used to take notes, and this is maybe anecdotal thing that's not really relevant, but anyway, it came to my mind. I used to be a note taker for deaf students and people different. So I used to sit in and write what the lecturer was talking about. I had to write as quickly as I could, you know, and I must have had some aptitude for it because I was given the job. But I used to go to court cases and to hospitals and wherever somebody who was deaf needed to be reminded of what something serious was being said. So, and there was lots of rules about what you were to do. I mean, if there was somebody.
Did you type or did you write down?
It was sometimes in big meetings there was be a paleotypist, I think we call them, who were doing that live typing. But the they also wanted a note taker as well, because sitting beside the deaf person, because they'd be looking at your notes and they'd lip read, but they couldn't keep up the lip reading for very long. So there was this kind of interesting translation going on in different forms to help the person understand. And but if someone was laughing, you'd have to write laughter. If the fire alarm went off, you'd write fire alarm, or you'd have to be like a completely neutral filter for just everything that was being heard. You just write down, you know. No matter what, even if the person wasn't making sense, you would just write as best you could their nonsense down, you know. So you just became this sort of filter. So that's sort of, I don't know if that had any influence on me, you know, Marko, but I'm just saying it's a very parallel sort of activity to this sort of translating of an image into paint, where I find it quite easy to be just faithful. I don't find it boring, for example. I wouldn't find it any more interesting to add something extra in than not to, you know. So it wouldn't be for my own entertainment. And in fact, the restrictions and the sort of madness of just repeating something is, like what I'm doing right now. I'm sorry, I'm just waffling, but anyway, you've given me permission to do that, so I will. I'm scraping out, I've got all these old tourist books of Scotland, actually, because on the internet, sort of 1960s photographs of the Highlands and that. So I think they're quite funny. And I've been scraping out circles in the image and gessoing up to the surface of the photograph again, and then painting in the bit that's missing.
Oh, wow.
So it's just replacing what was there, but I've taken away and then putting it back. And the temptation is to add something in it, like a tower block, or something witty, or something commentary on something. But I feel that I'm not going to do that, because the not doing it, and just the madness of just the pointlessness of putting back what was already there and adding nothing more than the time spent repairing something you've destroyed, or that's much more interesting to me. And the point, if I have a point, whatever that is, that speaks to the point, whatever my point is, as opposed to noticing that this one's, I don't know, got a tower block in the landscape that I've introduced. That would be so horrible, and I don't know, I would find that too much of an imposition for trying to make a point, which ultimately nobody really wants to hear what really, my jokes or something like that, I don't think. Anyway, that's how I operate. I find it at least as interesting to say nothing in that sense as to say something obvious in the pictorial sense, So it's just another example of the kind of.
That's amazing.
But I find that quite funny in a funny old sort of.
Yeah.
I don't. It's sort of slightly cheeky and. Yeah.
I can really see the kind of wit in not being witty.
Yeah.
And you're presenting us with an absence of need to kind of overthink things, and I think that is in itself a commentary.
A reticence to allow, say, a potential viewer, to sort of say, "Oh, I get it," like that's what it's about. I mean, I like to say, I was looking the other day at Sherry Levine's Walker Evans photographs. I respect. I mean, yeah, that sort of she just photographed his photographs, and of characters from the Midwest America, but she just rephotographed them and framed them again, so they were absolute, just copies from a book photographically, and that was it. But of course, the fact that she'd done them is a different context. I'm not doing that. And she was talking about feminism, things like that, but which is really interesting. But it's amazing that you can talk about a lot of things by doing nothing or very little. I find that really quite interesting. I just find that really fascinating. And again, this is going back to copyright. When one of the mitigating circumstances for copyright is transformative use, for example, and it's the amount that you've changed something. And I really like the idea of, why should change be a sign of creativity? The only sign of creativity, because it's really very easy to change something. It's not really creative at all. It's obviously how you change it, but also not changing something is really interesting. And another, just firing little anecdotes at you, but this was it Slavoj Žižek is mentioned in a book. I remember talking about this woman in a hotel, and she was screaming out of her bedroom. She came down to the concierge and screaming, somebody's robbed my room. You must come up, you must come up. And so the concierge comes up and the other staff, and they go into her room and say, Madame, it looks perfectly in order. Nothing seems to be changed at all. She says, can't you see? They've come in and gone through all my stuff and put it all back exactly in the right place. And it's just the fact that her fantasy was that this should been invaded in some way, but that the room was totally untouched and perfectly as it should be. but yet she had this idea that this event had happened in the meantime, and she was exasperated that they couldn't see this, the terror, why she should be so alarmed by this. Yeah. And they just saw nothing, and I like the idea that there's this hidden fantasy of, disguised intervention. I mean, she might well have been crazy, but I find that amusing.
I think that just offers a real, I don't want to say alternative, in areas of design and fashion where there is this obsession with originality and, certainly not in the art world, there is this obsession with the things that have never been seen before. And so I think this is a very poignant image of, just the absurdity of that obsession.
Yeah, it's none of this is to say that I don't enjoy, unusual innovations and things like that. It's just my approach. It's certainly a sort of investigation into a kind of minimal intervention. I just find that fascinating when I see examples of it. But again, it's just one aspect of my work, and I love the sort of madness of it. It's sort of Beckettian, Samuel Beckett.
Very, yeah.
I love that. There's one, again, another little anecdote I'll throw your way about Malloy, or one of his characters, sort of down and out, who there's several pages in one of the books about him wrestling with these stones in his pockets that he wanted to suck the stones, but he wanted to suck them one after the other. He didn't want to suck the same one twice. He wanted to have a good suck of all of the stones from the beach in order. And so he's got like 8 pockets or something in his jacket or in his trousers. And he finds a system where he can swap them around so that he ensures that he can't. And it's something quite complicated, sort of mathematical thing. And you get kind of involved in his effort to do this and his frustration with trying it out and it not working and trying something else out. And you forget that the whole point is just so you can suck a stone, which is a completely stupid thing to do. But that doesn't matter. It's the whole getting there and it's funny, it's ultimately absurd. And there's something sort of heartwarming and about that. So I love all that kind of thing. An artist like Sol LeWitt have always been in my head, I see them as very absurd as well, these sort of rules and extravagant sort of installations that are kind of pointless, but very, very human and funny, I think. I see him as very funny. I mean,
yeah.
Not everybody does, but I find them very so it's funny as I speak to you, as I realize one, I've been within my sort of more, a lot of people see the work as photorealist or something like that, and we haven't talked about that particularly because it's not really relevant. I mean, I use photographs and I like photographs, but within the using photographs to work from, I like to steal from ideas from, other art forms, 1960s conceptual artists, and do a version of them, but if to take Michael Asher's work, but to do a version with my paintings to try some of that, exposing the gallery, like he took down the wall of the gallery famously, that kind of thing. And
it's a curatorial practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think
you might be more of a curator than a photographer then. If you were to have an additional category.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't believe in categories, but there you go.
No, you're right. Yes, I'll curator of my own work. I've shied away from curating other work.
Well, I guess within your work, you may be curating other work.
Yeah. Maureen Paley calls me a sculptor, which is like, I'm not quite sure.
Oh, wow.
She has done in the past. I think it's just, well, I like it because it throws a spanner in the works, because it's like, well, hang on, how's that work? I don't think it doesn't have to be answered, but it's nice to say, okay, because I deal with space, in some way. So, yeah, but I always sort of pull it back to painting, but try and think about, it's nice, it's a good exercise, I think, to think about. I mean, you might see a contemporary dance piece and to think, well, how could I apply that to painting? How does that? Or even a stand-up comedian, you know.
Yes, I mean, you could go quite far with with that.
So yeah, I find that has been quite, you know, when I get to these moments when I have to do the thinking rather than the making, it's that sort of, that's what I do really. Yeah, I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm feeling a little bit like I'm being less rule-based to start with. But I really am also, of course, worried that in a way they'll just become like very subjective images that the world doesn't need, you know. Like, well, does the world need anything? But you know, just another picture of a thing, you know, that feels like inadequate. You know what I mean? I'm sure you have rules as well, or work in series. Everybody does things like that to sort of.
A lot of what you're saying and what you do resonates with me, because I can't imagine a work without having like another 5 of those that kind of, well, I see it as a certain form of exploration, but you know, I have this kind of internal battle with a work as a work without any reference to something else.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely. I mean, in a way, I would love that to be possible, but I find it very unsatisfying for me. All these things I'm saying are the sort of dictums and rules. I apply them to myself, not to other people. You know, certainly when I talk to students.
Yeah.
But you know, everybody has. But I can't. I would find it very difficult. I mean, if you work in series as well, if you took any one work out of the series, it would be a very different thing for it to sort of stand. What would it show someone? You know, that's the thing. Without the others there to back it up or to be in conversation with, it would show if it's just. I mean, sometimes I don't really worry about this, Marko, but it's like if I make a series of works and they're going to be shown in a particular gallery or exhibition space or something like that, and then what happens after that when they're divided up or even just, you know, I don't know how that works for that image, you know, unless there's a sort of.
Do you not have rules in terms of this painting needs to be sold with that other painting?
Well, you know, it would be lovely to be able to make such demands on the world.
Yeah, to sell all of them. It
doesn't always work like that, as far as I'm aware. But I know for the last exhibition, I was doing these fairly random imagery in a way. I didn't know there wasn't a rule to start with, really, and I'd be building upon the series as I was going along. I could paint a flower. The next one would be a car, or you know, whatever, or giraffe. I painted even, you know.
Oh yes, I love those. So
they were really pretty random, and I didn't know what I was going to paint really particularly until I'd finished the last one, and sort of a sort of balancing act or rerouting the series. But nevertheless, they were a series. They were a whole. You know, they wouldn't, the giraffe on its own. I mean, I don't mind if somebody. I would love somebody to buy it and whatever, hang it on the wall. It's like, but I would love it if they knew it was part of a series. I saw it in that series, and you know. To me, it worked as the series, even though they were standalone, they were sort of distinct. The content was different, but the series that still formed this whole. You know, that's quite obvious, really. But what was I going to say? But even in that exhibition, yeah, we made groups of 4 or 5 that would be enough of a variety to kind of make a run. That would make like a short section of this narrative of this film.
A sequence, yeah.
So you would get a range of imagery which would disrupt any rules you could make in it. You know, any, you know, typology. You know, like it's not all about animals or whatever. You know, it had to be like there had to be a black painting, an abstract, just a black shape, and a giraffe, like 2 car doors and. That could be a group. So we spent a bit of time sort of making groups that could be theoretically, unfortunately, sold. You know, we'll see how that goes. But so I had to think about really a bit more carefully about how they would make sense at all, because I think that was because the imagery was so diverse. You know, it wasn't all the same thing, so it became more of a apparent that they had to have a sort of they had to make sense afterwards.
Yeah, I guess that's the element of curation.
Yeah, it really was, and you're right. In this particular one, it was very curated. I curated it myself. I curated it as I made the images, and then I curated it as I hung them. That took a lot of doing, and it made such a difference. The different ways I did it. This is amazing. And then it's curating how they might be broken up in the future if they are. So yes, there's a bit of curation. You're right. I think that's how it makes sense to me. Even if the images aren't as strictly conceived by a rule that comes before them, like. But so I still find I need that some sort of. I think that comes from the fear that